The following program is a SUTV student production. The views expressed are not necessarily those of Salisbury University, the University System of Maryland, its regents, administration, officers, employees, or representatives.
Hi, and welcome to Hot Topics. I'm Roberta Ewane, and here with me today I have President of the NAACP, Dorien Rogers. Hi, Dorien. How are you?
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you for having me.
I'm happy that you're here. So, Dorien, tell me more about the NAACP.
That's a great question. So the NAACP, known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has been around for well over 100 years, 1909 to be specific, and they are the oldest, and I mean the oldest of the boldest organization when it comes to fighting for civil rights for not only people of color, but people of marginalized groups. It's a very intersectional organization. And so we, in order to be around for a very long time, it needs to be consistent, and that's exactly what we are.
Do you know how long the NAACP organization has been around in Salisbury University?
A very long time, very long time.
So it's an integral part to the university's community, right?
Correct.
So tell me more about what the NAACP does on campus.
That's a great question. So as a NAACP chapter here at SU, how can we interconnect the experiences that we hold with our students, our staff, and our faculty to ensure that we're pushing our advocacy, again, for not only equity, but equality for all? Again, I was saying it's a very intersectional organization, and with that in mind, how do we not only build community so that when it comes to our programming, when it comes to our events, when it comes to just sitting down and building relationships with the people around us, how do we take that relationships and that community and then give people the resources and tools necessary to, again, advance their advocacy, whether it's through curriculum, because again, a lot's going on at SU, when it comes to mental health and normalizing that so it's not a stigma, more so a normalized thing that is beneficial to all people regardless of students, staff, or faculty. And when it just simply comes to, again, student activism, because there's a lot going on in our communities and abroad. And so that's what we would like to do here as a Salisbury University chapter.
Speaking of going on, what communities on campus do you feel are integral to diversity and inclusivity?
That's a really great question. So, again, when we talk about NAACP, and I use this example because, with this year in particular, we're seeing a lot more people on campus, and so that meant a lot more face-to-face interaction, of course with the mask. Continue to wear your mask, ladies and gentlemen. But, a lot of people had the idea that, oh, when I see NAACP, it's just for black people, and I'm here to say it is not just for black people, because one little thing about NAACP that y'all can share with y'all friends is that the founders of NAACP come from intersectional groups. You have people of color, you have women of color, women of different sexual orientations, men of different sexual orientations, people with disabilities. It's an intersectional hub, again, when it comes to being the oldest and boldest organization for civil rights. And so as long as you have the determination to make a change and stand up for the person next to you, this organization's for you. And so it's very intersectional and it's pivotal to, again, advancing equity and inclusivity here and abroad.
So you mentioned earlier that NAACP is doing a lot on campus to promote diversity and inclusivity, but there have been some issues with that between the campus and these groups, these diverse, inclusive groups. You mind speaking a little bit more on that?
So, people tend to have the mindset that this is just boiling over just before the vandalism. And in fact, we're actually coming up on our 2-year anniversary of the first recorded racial vandalism that took place within Fulton Hall.
Yes.
Again, people only talk about the one referencing Sandy Hook, when in reality there was 6 known. And so we're actually coming up on the 2nd-year anniversary of the first one. And so with that in mind, people think that that's when things started to go south. They thought that things were already in its worst, but in reality, this has been going on for years. And again, that's important because when you don't have a historical paper trail to show that there's inequities and there's stigmas and there's racism, discrimination, sexism, ableism, and attacks against LGBTQIA, like they're here. And so people think that, again, it stemmed from 2 years ago and it's been around for a long time. And so we're really reaching the boiling point where, again, students of intersectional backgrounds and marginalized groups don't feel included here. They don't have the structural resources that they needed because those resources, for example, multicultural student services, has been plucked from the administration, and again, by the administration. And you're having it so where a lot of students, and to be frank with you, being at a predominantly white institution, they don't see it because it's not in the lens as if it's affecting them. And so it's as if it's going under the rug, and that's where a lot of students of multicultural and intersectional backgrounds are at right now.
Speaking of under the rug, there have been things going on campus that not everyone is aware of, specifically that the Black student organizations are essentially dying. They have little help from advisors, if they have any at all, or little help from the school. So, mind going into that a little bit?
I'd love to. So I just want to make an emphasis. It's not just Black organizations. You know, I'll give some demographics here. We're around 13% Black and African descent when it comes to the demographics of Salisbury University. That then goes down to our Latinx. We're only around 3%. Our Asian Pacific Islanders, you know, there's only around 2 or 3%. And so again, when you're going to marginalized groups on campus, to your point, you know, where are the structural resources? We had Multicultural Student Services, which was built by Mr. Vaughn White. He was the director of Multicultural Student Services, and once he retired, students were calling for a new director. And you know, that was important because that office has been around for well over 2 decades. That held the Multicultural Alliance, again, those organizations you're speaking about, and it also held our Powerful Connections program. And so when this chief diversity officer was then implemented and brought here, they had uprooted that office. So the budgetary, they collapsed and they were all conformed into one budget. That meant that a lot of the programming that they didn't do it anymore. There was no more director positions. So that meant that the people that were program coordinators, they have one, they had to do all the responsibilities. And that also added to and I'm quoting this because this is what a lot of students and even staff were saying, a toxic work environment. And so you had a low retention rate of staff within those offices. Again, those staff had relationships with those students, again, those organizations, and when those staff members left, you know, again, students felt stuck and they didn't feel the support of the Office of Diversity Inclusion nor the administration. And so, and I want to make sure I hit your question precisely, you know, again, when you have student organizations that don't feel supported, why are they going to come forward? And that's what's happening right now. Again, that's not only just for NAACP, and I don't want to speak for the other organizations, but I know the president of OAS has articulated as well to the administration. The organization, the Caribbean Student Association, another great example. African Student Association, Black Student Union, APIC, Asian Pacific Islanders Club, it goes down the line, but we don't have the structural support that we used to have. It's been cut away, but yet they market diversity, equity, inclusion. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, you answered it perfectly, even. Which leads me to my other question, not second question, but my next question. What do you think the school can do to support these groups more, to show that they stand with them and they are willing to do these, to help them stay afloat?
That's a great question. So, you know, again, we hear from the administration and the faculty and, again, our representatives, so student government, for our example, we hear the common word choice of we're here to listen, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with listening. However, we need to match our actions to our words. And so with that in mind, you know, from an NAACP perspective, the first thing that we need to see happen is there needs to be the reappointment of a director of multicultural student services. That's the very first thing that needs to happen because, again, the structure that Mr. White was developing as a director for the time that he's been in was, again, that led to greater successes for students, specifically students of multicultural backgrounds. In addition to students who may not have, you know, they may not be of color, but again, different intersectional backgrounds. And they would be more successful. They'd be more involved student leaders on campus. And so by bringing back that director position, it gives back the sphere of structure necessary for example, them to manage their finances, to then allocate and give more resources to Powerful Connections, which although financially is under the president's office, that's still important because then it gets more outreach so students can get to organizations. They can utilize what they learn in the classroom to then take that back to civic engagement, to be more involved and engaged citizens, which is what we stand for as an institution. So that should be the very first thing. Second thing that needs to happen, there needs to be greater recruitment and retention of staff of color, and specifically of color, within the counseling center. It's no secret that counseling center is underfunded. It's no secret that it's understaffed. In fact, with the data within the International Accreditation for Counseling Services, they recommend there should be a counselor for 1 to every 1 to 1,500 counselors. And as of right now, it looks like we only have 3 full-time counselors in addition to about 3 or 4 part-time and some GA sprinkled in there.
And this is things like the school isn't really reporting on. Most of these things, normal students don't typically know, especially if they're not as involved with campus as you are. So we don't know that these inefficiencies are occurring, and we don't know that these things are not being done. But speaking of President White, it recently came out that he resigned. Just real quick for our last minute of the show, what is something that you want the next president to be aware of and work on?
Well, I can say that it was an honor working with Dr. White, and he has done what most presidents probably would not have done when it came to being receptive. But again, matching your actions with your words. If you're going to bring students to the table and you're asking for recommendations and they keep bringing the same recommendations, it's probably a sign that you need to implement it. Case closed. But I wish him the best of luck. But for the next president, match your actions to your words.
Thank you for that. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up today's episode of Hot Topics. Thank you so much for joining me, Dorien, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great night.